And I think what the conversation we had with Dragos was a great, setup for the rest of the afternoon, in which we are going to talk not about the digital industry strictly per se, but we're going to talk about the way in which Europe is facing threats that are linked also to our digital prowess. There is a thread that goes through it. The next panel is really about, do we know we're at war with China? Do we know we're in a trade war with China? Are we sufficiently clear that that is happening? And what are we going to do about it? And that China has created, of course, a fantastic tech ecosystem in 15 years that we can only dream of at this point in time. So all of this, I will get out of the way and I will leave to Sander and the rest of this wonderful panel to expand on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christina. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a highlight of the year. I think following the conversation with Dragos, this is a particularly good sequence because the IIA and the industrial response is a key part of the China debate. I know a lot of you are not macroeconomists or trade experts, which is great. And so with that in mind, I thought I would maybe set the scene a bit on what this debate's about, and then move to this excellent panel who hopefully will have different views that we can discuss. So maybe to start with a big observation and then give you three sets of threes. The big observation, I think, from Draghi is that Europe is behind on the cutting frontier, you know, the unusual companies that really excel. We all know this. We know that a lot of that debate's about the single market, about capital markets union. But we also know that Europe still has a very powerful industrial base and that it excels in not only still cars, if I may say, but also machine tools, advanced robotics. And all of that part of the equation is under pressure from China's very, very heavily skewed export-driven growth model. When we met last year, China's trade surplus was 1 trillion. We're now approaching 1.3 trillion, so we've added 300 billion in essentially demand displacement for the rest of the world. Now, I wanted to give you three sets of threes. So, first of all, what are the three drivers of China's staggering export-led growth? I think conceptually, it's a tripod. So the first is a lack of domestic demand in China. China's consumption rate is below 40%, an exceptionally low level. It has very high excess savings. And so in some ways, the Chinese economy is always looking for demand, and that has to come from the export side as long as the government's not willing to invest in consumption at home. The second fundamental driver is industrial policy, widespread CCP industrial policy. Since the real estate bubble burst in China, new lending in industry, in priority sectors, from cars to machines, to aircraft and aviation, has quintupled. So we've seen a five-folding of lending growth into building new factories, essentially, since 2020. That is a lot of supply coming online, meeting not so much demand, and again, the way out is exports. And the third driver is a, I would say, consensus now, wildly undervalued exchange rate. So the renminbi has depreciated a lot versus especially the euro over the last year and a half, and that of course accelerates and turbocharges the export boom. Now there are three, I think, fundamental implications for Europe. The first is very clear in the trade data. China's exports in volume terms, there's also quite a bit of deflation given that supply and demand are mismatched, but in volume terms, Chinese exports have grown 40% over the last 4 years, and imports are basically at zero. So if China is gaining that much market share, somebody is losing, and that is Europe. So Europe's exports are growing below global trade. German exports are particularly weak, given that its sector composition is similar to China's now, and there's real economic damage. A second implication is the interplay with Trump. You know, Europe basically relied on the American market to offset some of the losses that it's incurring in China. Europe's exports to China are in rapid decline because of all these dynamics. The US provided an offset. That offset is at least partially stymied by rolling back the Inflation Reduction Act, tariffs, and all the rest. A third implication, which I think our first speaker knows a lot about, is that a China that was basically going towards a 40% share of global manufacturing, is mainly exports, no imports, will automatically, unequivocally have many more choke points on the global economy. More markets where it's a monopolist, and more markets where Europe and others rely on its supply. So 3 drivers, 3 implications, and I think there are 3 sets of policy tools discussed, which is where the disagreements come in, and I hope my panelists lean into those. What can Europe do? I think there's a question of raising domestic demand. So if China is not providing the demand, maybe we have to do it ourselves, and the German fiscal revolution is a key part of that discussion. There's a discussion about basically deploying trade defenses more vigorously, and Drago said that's uncomfortable terrain for Europeans. We don't want to impose high tariffs on China, but maybe we should. How do we feel about that? A difficult discussion. The current Commission approach of going product by product is like basically shooting with a pea shooter at an elephant. It's not really working. So that's a second big discussion, and I think a third one is the one we just had, which is about Buy European. Can you design policies that steer more of Europe's demand into our own production in a world in which China is doing very much the same and has done for a long time? So with that, I wanted to get all of your views on that set of the 3 trees and sort of how we think about this. And I wanted to first start with JANKA, who's followed the EU-China relation from Berlin for a long time. You are a big expert on this. Berlin is probably the most exposed. What are its politicians doing? I sometimes get the sense that there's this hope that if only we attract more Chinese investment, you know, we can basically make our way out by welcoming Chinese tech, and then we can catch up. That seems like too much of a free lunch. But give us a sense of what Berlin's doing and what you think, whether this is enough. Maybe also with the focus on the security, economic security risk.
Thank you, Zander, and thank you for the invitation. I think last time I spoke in a room full of free traders from Great Britain, I said the word, we may have to close parts of our market, and I was about to be booed off stage. So let's see what happens here. I'm excited to see what happens. So maybe let's start with this sort of assumption of, we are, as a pre-point, we are caught between the US and China, is what most people say. That's wrong language, because it's this passive language, as if we have nothing to do with this, as we're the poor victims of this, right? So my first point is we have to change our language. If we make ourselves passive observers of this situation, where things are done to us, we are undermining our own potential. So that is about changing the mindset. We are not helpless recipients of Chinese surpluses. I think that's just watch how this is being phrased in the media often. We are kind of, the wave is coming, we're overrolled by this. That's just not true. They're not shoved down our throats, right? So these are purchased by companies and consumers in a regulatory environment that enables this. And we have created this environment, and we have choices. These are choices we make. And so we can choose to do otherwise. The security challenges that you were talking about, they're related to this, right? You cannot say that there are direct, hard security challenges coming from Chinese surpluses. That would be a stretch. There are direct security challenges that emanate, though, from the dominance of China in these product categories, in critical infrastructure, from communication, energy systems to transportation. Sabotage, disruption, cybersecurity risks, espionage risks. These are direct security risks that we are exposing ourselves to. But I think what's more important, that would be my second point, are the indirect security risks that we are exposing ourselves to by the choices that we make. The loss of the industrial base, price dependence, the loss of know-how, heightened dependencies, the lack of choices that we will have in times of crisis, the more dependent we are, the issue linkage that is constantly happening now from all sides on this, and the loss of regulatory sway. I love when European regulators say, well, we will just regulate it. If you have no more choice in the market, you will not regulate the product. It's really clear. So I think that's something that we're underestimating. These indirect challenges are much harder to mitigate, they're much harder to communicate about, and they are more likely to happen, and thus more likely, much more consequential. And that leads immediately to my third point I would like to sort of start off with. Chinese investment in Europe and the idea of technology transfer will not save us. It can even make things worse. because necessary steps of sort of recreating industrial power are inhibited or made harder because of the dangling lure of Chinese investment. The Chinese leadership, and I've been working on China for almost 20 years of my life, the Chinese leadership is super clear, you just have to read it, about they do not want to do technology transfer. That's not the point, because that would actually make their position weaker, and they have no interest in doing so. So if we wanted to say, well, we have power, right? We can sway them a bit. We can make sure that they transfer the technology. Sure, we would all have to work together. We all have to have the same categories. We all have to have the same criteria, and we would have to put the entirety of the European market on the one side of that balance. Then we can maybe negotiate. But are we ready to do that in the short term? I don't think so. And as long as we're not ready to do that, this short-term lure of the Chinese investment will be fantastic for policymakers, because what is better in an election year than to announce a new factory in southern Spain or a new factory in northern Italy? Because that's something, whether it is actually built or not, doesn't actually matter so much. The announcement is the political capital, and the Chinese government knows that. I would say beware of the Carney folly as well. I know the enthusiasm about the Carney speech was large, but quite frankly, as a European, if you invoke Václav Havel 4 days after you've signed a strategic partnership agreement with the Chinese Communist Party, I take you a lot less seriously. So I think we have to be really careful about what that means. And then my final point on Berlin. I think Berlin doesn't know it yet, but this is all dependent on Berlin. Without Berlin changing, none of this will happen. And I say that as a German, and I'm constantly aware of the responsibility that falls on us, because Brussels can fight all they want, and I think they're on a good track on a number of these files. But without Berlin's support, this will all fall short, and none of this will happen. We see good signs coming from the new administration, not so new anymore, now almost a year as well, but they are still kind of wavering. They're going in two directions. It's unclear where things are going. They're not on a terrible trajectory. Some decisions are good, some decisions are worse. But if you read the Mainzer Erklärung, sounds horrible, substance is even worse, because it's the growth agenda of the German Conservative Party that is completely tone deaf to the geopolitical environment. That's where the party is. Then you have Merz, who actually is a lot further along, but this is a problem that we don't have a consistency here. Merz will visit China end of February. This is where we will see maybe where his personal direction of travel is going. But I can tell you, with like 5 tricky elections next year on the local level in Germany ahead, he doesn't have an easy time. And I would just end on saying, in this room, we can all hope that Friedrich Merz finds his inner Adenauer or his inner Kohl and becomes a great European, because if he doesn't, we're all screwed.
Janka, thank you. Very clear messages. Joanna, I wanted to go to you to give us the Commission's view, your own views on these issues. Specifically, there is a debate ongoing on Europe's trade defenses, whether they're too piecemeal and small. I called it a P-gun. And whether Europe should indeed, let's say, declare an emergency at the WTO and put a wider tariff on China of, say, 15%, with the demand that China, for example, revalue its currency. But there is also the whole domestic response, which is arguably a bit more up your alley, on how do we design our own policies to outgrow or maybe do sectoral rotation to move away from this shock. So what's the Commission's thinking, and do you think that we are indeed screwed, or is there something we can do about it?
Thank you very much, Sander. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess you also expect a very clear answer from me, right? I will try to do my best, though I would rather paint a picture or a range of answers than one definitive. But thinking about the way you pitch the problem, I can go point by point, and I can try to give you answers to all blocks that you have highlighted. But I think that what you are really asking about is if we are ready with our policies, if we are ready with our tools, and if we are ready to stand up and act vis-à-vis the reality that is as difficult as we have been seeing over the past months. So this is a question about how well are we equipped with what we have already put in place, and how willing or determined or ready we are to act. I think this is really the gist of the point as I understand it. And so I will give you a couple of lines along which the Commission is thinking, and the Commission and the Member States. But let me maybe start with one general point, which is that a couple of weeks of this year has demonstrated that there is a huge room for disruption and instability. And this is instability coming from the US because of the shift of the policy. This is instability coming from China because China doesn't fit multilateral system as we had known it earlier. And there are elements that we can control, but there are elements that we do not control. And I think we have to focus on exactly what we can do when we can expect some results. And this is about economic security, this is about working with partners, and this is about working on internal capacity and capability. And I think these are the three axes that we have been working on for the past months and years. Now, I will not be talking about where China is because we have heard about it. I would rather recap what we have to face. And what we have to face is the trajectory that has been set and will not change. China model of state-led economy, which is driven by overcapacity and dominance by tech, will not change. We have to live with it. So expecting that by our asks China will change the trajectory, that will not happen. Secondly, China is not particularly keen to address our concerns, whether these are daily concerns or longer-term ones, and China is very much focused on transactions making. Now we have to ask ourselves a question, where is the transaction we can make? So what is our leverage? What is our strength? China is pretty much emboldened by the recent success, not least politically, and the upper hand it feels it has over the US, and not too much concerned about its internal weaknesses that are not of the nature that would make them change or act now. So there is ample time for us, if we do not act, to actually mess things even worse. So this is the reality we have to look at and tackle. Now, we haven't been thinking about it since yesterday, and we haven't been thinking about it even since 2019 Outlook that put in place, I think, pretty valid understanding of China. So I will not be talking about what we put in the communication 6 years ago or 7 years ago, but rather focus on how we implemented this communication and what are the lessons to be learned. And I think what is important to say, and this is not self-flagellation or this is not admitting a mistake, but this is a realization that going forward, our policy towards China has to be much more anticipatory, much more comprehensive. We have to act much more firmly on the global understanding of the problem rather than acting on case by case. This is a little bit what you referred to when you were speaking about trade defense measures. I think this is one of the reflexes that indeed there is a problem, we act, and even if we multiply, that doesn't really change the reality. So the idea that we have to act on China in a much more comprehensive way is there, and this is very much what is the outlook for the future. So what are the priorities and what is it that we should be doing? And I'm sure you will have different views, or not everyone will agree, or you will say, well, but there are gaps. But I will nevertheless highlight a couple of points that are important. You can break it down into what is more immediate. I don't want to say urgent, because everything is urgent, but there are some asks that are more immediate that we have to tackle. There is a long-term policy that we have to look at. But apart from this, and I will develop it in a moment, I think there are two very important factors that we haven't been discussing enough. And in the end, they very much determine how we are going to work with those policies and tools. And this is understanding of the costs of the change, understanding of the retaliation, what it means for us in terms of acting or not acting, and a question of political unity of the member states. We are not a unitary country, we are 27, and if we want to stand up to the problem as big as China, we have to stand up preferably 27. Doesn't always happen, but these are the two, I would say, less tangible, but even more important elements for a policy to be successful. So now very briefly about what would be more immediate or immediate urgent to act on. Certainly export controls, we have heard about it a lot, and we know that the solutions that we have found so far, they are sort of working. But we have a deadline of October approaching, and we'll have to find more stable, predictable understanding or deal, preferably between the two of us. We will have to work on much longer-term policy of diversification and de-risking, and this is the EU resource. You have also been thinking about it. So what is the policy there? There is a clear agenda for how to speed up diversification on critical raw materials. So this is one element of urgencies. Then there are all types of market access problems for exporters, but for investors in China, which are tremendous. I don't want to quote 1,100 items that have been listed by the Chamber of Commerce, European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, but this is as many as we face. Of course, that's a question of approach. Is it the right one or not? But there are multiple market access barriers in China, and this is something we need to continue discussing, which I should have said maybe earlier. We have to continue discussing with China. We have to defend our back, but we have to talk to China. There is no way we don't talk. So that is maybe one thing to make sure it's clear to everyone. So now, on the longer term, maybe two legs. One is the economic security. Again, I will not bore you with quoting communication that you can read yourself, but nevertheless, there are a couple of points that are worthwhile mentioning. And something I should not be discussing, as has been said by the previous discussion, which is accelerator, because this is in the making, but there is an important element to keep in mind, and I will also refer to this. So on the economic security, which is very much policy streamlined across the board, and it is very pertinent to what we do with China, but beyond, let's be clear, there are more difficult cases as we see daily than just China, and we all have to tackle them. But coming back to what I said earlier about China outlook, we have to anticipate much better. We cannot just react. We cannot just deploy 10 more TDI cases, or we cannot go to WTO. I mean, we can, of course we can, with yet another WTO challenge. We have to understand where risks are coming from and think what is the broad range of mitigating measures, from regulatory to financial to enforcement. And this is something that is underpinning the economic security strategy across the whole economy, many sectors of economy. So risk assessment and mitigating measures, and then anticipating what makes sense to deploy. We have to work with partners. This is not a walk that you walk alone. And because of that, it is so important to keep in mind how to define our internal policies and what implications that would have for working with the outside world. So thinking how we work with our partners. Then if we deploy tools, we have to think whether these tools are mutually supportive or undermine each other. So there is a very different way proposed to indeed kickstart whatever we have at our disposal, and we have a lot. I don't think this is a matter of the limited tools that we have. It is about how we act on that. On the internal plan, what I wanted to say about accelerator and our thinking about internal capacity or capability, no one would question this. I think we are all for. What Dragos said is very much what I would subscribe to. Now, we have to do it in a manner that industrial policy of the EU takes into account that we have to work with China, with Japan, with Korea, and with the rest of the world. And by the way, sometimes with China, because there are technologies, there are inputs that we cannot do without for time to come. So we really have to be very clever and very careful about designing the parameters of made in Europe or made with Europe, as some would say. Very important point to keep in mind. And I would add one more point. There is a tendency of saying, well, let's rework, let's re-engineer China approach. Let's become like China. Let's transfer technology, let's do a couple of other things, because they have been doing very successfully. I want to make it very clear. This is not the way to go ahead, not because we don't have the scale, the capacity, the financial support. This is not the way to go about developing the economy and to working globally on the challenges that are ahead. This is not about becoming Chinese, and this is a very dangerous shortcut and thinking ahead for anyone. So this is not about doing as China did. Now, there are two more points that I mentioned earlier that I think are important for the discussion, and this is retaliation and the costs of the change, costs of building of economic security. We do not talk enough about it. We are indeed worried and concerned what the reaction will be, if at all we go ahead with a measure that we can go ahead as 27. And there are costs, because China retaliates automatically. But we have to understand that retaliation is here to stay. And any measure, any reflection about efficiency of our tools will have to take this into account. Will not do without. As long as we are scared of retaliation, we'll be paralyzed. But that also means we have to understand we are not protecting status quo. We are thinking about what policies should be put in place in the future and how we can live with those. And the last point, and I will end with this, is the unity among member states. Extremely hard challenge. China is playing this card very well, very successfully, by whatever means there are, and there are many. And I think what we have to do collectively, and as the policymaker and rule maker, to work much more closely with member states on understanding and mainstreaming China challenge in their internal policies, not expecting that we will have a concerted view of 27 member states, but those who can take things forward. And this discussion is being developed, it's being more and more present, but not enough. But to close without policy, without tools, and without willingness to act and courage to bear the costs or self-inflict the cost will be inflicted on us by the third party. And that is something we definitely do not want. So that is my take on what we can do.
Thank you so much. I want to pick up on your point on global partnerships, the global dimension a bit more with Maria and Shahin. But I think your last 2 points are a good bridge to FINBARR. The cost of retaliation and member states' unity. I think both have been central elements of what I would say are the two kind of totemic specific cases of tensions between China and Europe over the last 12 or so months, which is the EV tariffs that the EU implemented, WTO compliant, and the Netherlands spat with Beijing over the chips company Nexperia. And FINBARR, you are, one of the longest sort of followers of the EU-China trade relation on the beat. So I think it would be great to hear from you a bit more concretely what this means, what Joanna was saying.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Sander. One of the only on the beat. It's a very lonely place reporting on China and Europe. There's really not that many people doing it, which probably says something about the sense of urgency that isn't being felt around the continent. So, I mean, you'd initially asked me whether this the EV development, let's say last month or earlier this month, about a price undertaking, a supposed arrangement signalled a détente. And I think there's a very short answer to that from where I sit, and that's no. I've been a skeptic since the start of last year about all this chatter about an EU-China rapprochement or détente, however you want to put it. I feel like it was a simplistic narrative when people started talking about the three sides of the triangle, and if one of them pulls apart, the other two get closer together. I think there is too much water under the bridge. You talked about all of the trade issues. And I think you can look at both Nexperia and price undertakings on EVs through that lens of what would actually it take in order to get a détente or whatever, an improvement in the relationship that would actually suit Europe rather than on these sort of flimsy terms. I mean, I came back from holiday the day that the EV price undertaking thing was announced, and I woke up to some frantic messages from colleagues who'd been talking to, briefed by Chinese industry and by the Chinese MOFCOM, Minister of Commerce, that there was a major deal in the works. When I brought this to my contacts in Brussels, they said, don't get too excited. Which shows me that actually the Chinese on this front were desperate for a bit of good news. This is one of the things that they really want to get rid of, these EV tariffs, which tells me that there's actually some leverage here. If you're going to negotiate them away for what you're actually going to be a net loss, you're going to lose out on the tariff revenue in exchange for what? I don't see how that would be seen as a détente that would suit Europe. It may signal perhaps what happened, that Beijing has a shift in how it sees the conflict, and maybe that's something that can develop. But in substance, I certainly didn't see that as signaling anything major, and maybe I'll be wrong, proven wrong with the passage of time. But you talked about the statistics from last year, a price undertaking on EVs doesn't do anything to address the substance of what the Europeans see to be the problem. You know, I was looking at the granular numbers last week, 108% increase in Germany's trade deficit with China over the course of a single year, 70% decrease in the shipments of mid-sized saloon cars, 54% decrease in shipments of station wagons from Germany to China. I mean, that's really...
What's the biggest single export now, FINBARR? From Germany to China?
You know this one. I mean, we talk about this offline quite a lot. What's it called? Oh, unwrought gold is the biggest single import in the customs code from Germany to China. I mean, Germany doesn't even mine gold, so it's obviously some sort of crafty re-export coming from Switzerland. And that's symbolic. It overtook a certain kind of saloon car. You know, so obviously it's a silly little piece of data, but to me it's quite symbolic. There was a bloodbath across the board. So you can take this price undertaking as how it's been presented by those in the Chinese government as a major breakthrough. But I look at what the EU and the Commission has already done this year, and it doesn't show to me that there's any sign of major change. I mean, the Cybersecurity Act last week, they're going to make it mandatory for member states to ban Huawei and ZTE first in mobile networks and then branching out into lots of other nascent industrial sectors. Last week, Maroš Šefčovič put an op-ed in the FT about rewriting the rules at the WTO to say that most favoured nation would be earned rather than automatic. And if you read that, the paper that they circulated in Geneva, I mean, it's very clear. I mean, they see China as a major problem. So anyway, that's a long roundabout way of saying, no, I don't think that signals too much. I don't expect there to be a sort of Carney-esque détente. I don't think that the Canadians have the same industrial imperative as the Europeans. I mean, Canada is a commodity exporting economy. Maybe it makes some sense to pivot to China, but I don't know, I find that a little bit reductive, which sort of brings it on to Nexperia. I'll be brief on this one because I don't really think too much has happened in the last couple of months. There was this court case in the Netherlands the week before last, I think, in which it was quite clear that the two sides of the company are engaged in a civil war. They're really not on good terms, and again, it's unclear how you actually fix this problem, but to me it's almost like emblematic of the broader problems in the EU-China relationship. There's a distinct lack of trust. You know, the Europeans certainly have suffered from promise fatigue over the years about all the sort of promises to open the market, etc., and extend, you know, liberalization, etc. You know, that's been engendered by the trade problems, but also geopolitics. You know, look what's going on in Ukraine. Let's not forget, when we're talking about trade and competition issues, that overarching all of this are geopolitical issues which have made things a hell of a lot worse over the last almost 4 years now. So, I mean, when you look at this through the Chinese lens, I mean, why over the course of last year did they not come and offer anything to the Europeans? You know, everybody was talking about patching things up and, you know, the two sides of the triangle moving closer together, and I think it's a credibility problem. We've been talking about de-risking here in Brussels for almost 3 years now, and meaningfully what has happened. I remember watching a hearing of Minister Karaman's in December or November when he was talking to the Dutch Parliament about the Nexperia issue, and he basically said we had no idea, we did not expect that the Chinese would use export controls in response to us, you know, effectively seizing the Dutch part of the company, which to me was crazy. I mean, anybody who's watched the news over the last year would know that this is a tool that they're using fairly readily, but it also was a bit worrying. What has this de-risking been all about? All of these like consultations and therapy sessions that the Commission has been having with member states. I mean, where is it all going if we don't know that these chips, which are described as the salt and pepper of the car industry, you cannot build a car in Europe without these. If we don't even know that's a choke point, then, I mean, what does that say about the credibility of what Europe has been doing on the de-risking front over the last 3 years? And I hope I'm not coming across as too mean here to the good people in DG Trade who are trying their very best. But I mean, I think that also feeds into that question about you know, détente and leverage and so on, and the learning from what we saw with Nexperia is that that ship has sailed and that company has gone, and this is what happens when you give up your crown jewels. The EV tariffs are obviously a small piece of leverage. The two things that the Chinese seem to really care about are selling, getting a hold of ASML machines and getting rid of the EV tariffs. So for me, if you're talking about you know, dealing in this real world of you know, tough talk and might makes right and everything, you know, signing over one of the major pieces of leverage that you've created actually at a fairly early stage for peanuts, to me, doesn't make sense. So I'll wrap up there, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. With peanuts, yeah, you mean the fact that the Netherlands approved the sale of Nexperia a decade ago for...
Well, that was, I mean, that was a different time. You know, I mean, what can we learn from that is that, you know, we don't have any leverage. The Chinese have quite readily shown that they were willing to respond to whatever Europe did with Nexperia. Well, they seized the company. I suppose that's a point of leverage now. But I mean, if you don't want to get to that point, so you know, you don't want to give over what you have now, which is the EV tariffs, right? So I suppose there's a thread to be drawn there.
Thank you so much. Maria, there is some optimism in some pockets of Europe that the new FTAs, the new trade deals with Mercosur, with India, with Indonesia, the next one, will basically allow Europe to offset some of the damage from the collapsing exports to China, as FINBARR was laying out, from the US tariffs, and also our geopolitical lever to maybe build a new trade order, if I may put it that boldly. But of course, there's also the WTO, and you know a lot about these issues. So what's the role of everybody else, if you will, and how can Europe basically plot a course with partners? And is that enough, or do you think some of these other policy tools are key?
Yeah. So, yeah, if you allow me, I wanted to first of all thank you for including us in this conference and in this panel. If I may go a step back, there is a lot that has been said both here but also throughout the day about the need for economic security and sovereignty, of which economic security is part of that. And the question is, how do we get there? So I wanted to maybe add a little bit of sort of a slightly different nuance to this. The first thing I wanted to say, and if you allow me, I wanted to go back and say that we've now reached, and here the US comes in, into an era where tariffs, which are typically trade instruments, they are being used as the new sanctions. Yeah, if certainly coming from the US, which is something that is very detrimental to economic value, and we see that some of the effects in the US economy, and we will see them as we come along. If you look at the effects, the tariffs that the US is imposing across the world, they're close to 20% on average. You know, Europe and China are much lower than that, between 3 and 4 between the two countries. So I want to offer two principles of thinking about what to do with China, but more globally in the context of the global trading system. And the two principles to guide our policies, in my view, are two. One is old and the other one is new. The old one is that trade is about imports. It's not about exports. Export is what pays for the imports. Yeah, this is a very old thing that in trade theory we learn when we are students. And the new one, of course, is economic security. But what I wanted to add with economic security is that I would like to put economic security first and explain what I mean by that. Yeah. So on the trade side, Europe has preserved its imports, if you follow that principle, by not imposing tariffs, counter tariffs, retaliation. It has actually preserved the very principle of trade, which is preserve the welfare of the citizen that comes from choice through imports. So I think we've done that pretty well. The question is it enough? And what other choke points that are visible everywhere, including Nexperia, which I'd like to maybe in the second round talk a little bit about that as well. And the question is, how do we protect economic security? For one reason and one reason only, and I think others have mentioned this, and that is that it gives us choices. Without economic security, we have no choices. And if we don't have choices, we don't have leverage. So if you want to rewrite the WTO book, if you wanted to negotiate with others, you've got to have cards, as Trump used it. We have to have leverage. But we need choices if we need to have leverages, and that means that we need to have economic security up there if not next to, if not before productivity, at least very much next to the fight on productivity. I think this is crucial. And that comes from the fact that there is an intrinsic trade-off between the two. I think we need to acknowledge that. The trade-off between the resilience and the efficiency. And if you put that in a spectrum, I think we need to move closer to how do we protect resilience first, to acquire choices, and therefore then to design economic outcomes that are optimal in some sense. This is what I think we need to do, and we are doing this from a point of disadvantage because we are behind on the digital era. We are starting from a weak point when it comes to that. We are starting from a growth model that relied on exports that can no longer work. And the pivot that we need towards the domestic demand, the Draghi agenda, is a very difficult one to do in an environment of 27 sovereigns that can only agree that much. So even in an optimal scenario, the issue of fragmentation will remain. So that creates inevitably a weakness in the way that we organize ourselves, and that is why we need to acknowledge that trade-off and put economic security first. So acquire the options that are going to give us the leverage to negotiate when and if somebody holds a knife in our throat, right? So how do you do that? With China, on the EVs, actually EVs didn't work. I mean, we looked at the numbers, and actually if you see the value of EVs coming into the EU, before the tariffs they were going up like that. After the tariffs they flattened, but the volumes didn't. The volumes continued just like this for two reasons. The Chinese effectively switched from exporting those cars that were under tariffs into different kinds of cars that are not under tariffs, namely the hybrid cars. And the second reason is because they could absorb the pressure. Yeah? So effectively what this means is when you deal with China, you have two serious problems, and the one is scale. We will never have the scale that China does. When China does something good or bad, it will affect us. And the question is, and here I really agree with this issue of I need to anticipate. And the other thing that the EVs example has shown us is that China has tremendous agility to do effectively what it needs to do. And therefore, our economic statecraft instruments need to be developed to deal with a mighty adversary when it comes to certain issues of our economic protection. I think it's, tariffs won't do. The economic statecraft means, you know, the imports and export controls and export quotas and input controls, all of this need to be part of the toolkit in ways that are strategic and in ways that actually achieve the objective of this economic security. So when it comes to the WTO, there isn't anybody who disagrees that the WTO needs to be rewritten. But I want to argue the following. Is it possible to think of a world trading order without the US? Yeah? If you were to sort of follow what we're doing right now, the current system benefits China. In fact, we are where we are because of China, right? So till the US reverts back into slightly more cooperative, the only alternative is what you described, Sander, which is, of course, the bilateral agreements. This is the only way to save some of the economic income that comes in that will allow us to continue imports and therefore benefit from trade. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Can I ask two quick follow-up questions? So most estimates on the new FTAs suggest they're going to add a decimal or so of GDP to EU or Eurozone GDP over the medium term, let's say 0.1, 0.2. That seems marginal. So how, maybe you can give us sort of 20 seconds about how to think about that. And the second question, maybe another half a minute, is are you optimistic Europe will have its own rare earths refining or find new partners, or do you think we'll be still 95% dependent?
Yeah, on the trade deals, well, that's because that's not what the value is, right? I mean, the numbers are what they are. This is why China and the US are the two trading partners that we need to rescue. How we rescue it, the economic value is there, and that's what we need to get right if you want to talk about GDP numbers. On the second thing, not in real time. By that I mean not in a time that is going to solve the problems we are in. Maybe in the context of the long term, yes, but not in the real time. And I certainly think we need to pursue those options because economic security is not, the solutions to economic security are not immediate, they are long-term. We shouldn't stop for trying to immediately to solve some of that.
Great, thank you so much. The trading world is quite small without the US and China, I think. So I personally agree with you. Shahin, I want to go a bit back to, let's say, the big picture. France, you're based in Paris. France has tabled global macroeconomic imbalances as the key agenda item on its G7 calendar. That is very much about China's huge surpluses and the US's very large deficits. So to Maria's point, the two relations that we have to save, as you put it nicely. How optimistic are you that Macron and the team will be able to get China and the US to the table, and that there will be a new bargain that is more satisfactory for Europe, which does not push us in the direction that we've been discussing?
Thank you. I'm not very hopeful they'll be successful, but I think it's a good idea to try, and I think it's good to put the global imbalances question back on the table and to illustrate that it's not only a question of tariff, but it's a broader set of macroeconomic questions that includes the exchange rate. So I think from that perspective, if it can displace the conversation away from the current US obsessions of tariffs towards something else, it could be a useful contribution to the debate. But before, you've raised three important points on trade defense instruments, on boosting demand, and finally on global partnerships and cooperation. First, I would want to warn us against double standards when we think about economic security, and I still see a bit of that. You know, somehow with this new Cybersecurity Act, we're banning entirely Huawei and ZTE from our future mobile services, fine, but at the same time, we're creating new sovereignty rules that allow Microsoft and Amazon Web Services to brand their product as sovereign somehow, and I don't buy that they are. We still live in a union where there is not a single retail commercial payment that can take place without a US service provider involved, and without, actually even worse than that, without Target 2, so the payment system between central banks operating without a US service provider. So we still live in a world where, of course, China is a threat to our industry, but where another superpower can turn off the lights completely and turn us back to the Stone Age very quickly. And I think we should keep that in mind. So I think thinking about China is useful, but I think if anything, the last few weeks has reminded us that we should not be only obsessed about China, but there's other people to care about. On the point of trade defense instruments that has been raised, and then the EV tariffs and the price undertaking, I tend to share the view that the price undertaking is not a major deal in it for itself. The one thing we haven't said, which I think is crucial, is that it's a price undertaking for one company for the time being. And for which company? For Volkswagen. Why is that? So basically what we have created now is basically a vehicle for Chinese-made, German-branded cars to be sold to the European market at a price floor and for a maximum quantity. Is this the beginning of a bigger conversation that will open up other Chinese car makers to come to the market? Maybe. In that case, I think you may be proven wrong, and it could be the beginning of a bigger deal, or it's just a carve-out for Volkswagen, and I think that we don't know. And maybe the trip of the Chancellor to China will help us discuss that. But I think, in principle, thinking about targeted instruments and maybe more collaborative and negotiated instruments than tariff, to me, doesn't strike me as a bad idea. The history of that is pretty bad in Europe. I mean, we can take us back to solar panel price undertaking in 2013, and we know how that ended. So we don't have a great record of doing perfectly well-functioning price undertakings, but I want to believe, and maybe I'm naive in that we've designed the solar panel one very badly, and that we can learn from our mistakes and do price undertakings today that would be better. I am doubtful that blanket tariffs, 15% or more, against all Chinese goods would be a good idea. In part because, in reality, a number of these goods, there is no viable competition in Europe for them. You know, the reality is that we've lost the solar market panel a decade ago. Tariffing Chinese solar panel today, to me, would only produce one thing, just delaying our energy transition. And so I think we need to think about the Chinese relationship in two ways. Of course, it exposes our industry, but it also helps accelerate our energy transition and decarbonization. And I think that's a trade-off that we have to keep in mind, which I haven't heard us mention so far. Second, on boosting demand, and Sander should actually be a panelist because he's written an extraordinary paper a few weeks ago on what Europeans should do to boost demand by creating a smart Buy European EV framework. And I thought this was a very encouraging moment. But if I may say with a bit of disappointment, agreeing with what JANKA said earlier about the importance of Berlin here, Germany has issued a new subsidy scheme last week on EVs, which sadly does not follow the prescriptions of Sender, and in fact creates a subsidy scheme that does not create any buy-European preference and that is wholly open to Chinese cars. Why is that? Volkswagen. Because simply, German car makers today are in fact more Chinese car makers than they are German, and so we cannot create a European preference without profoundly undermining the German car industry. And I think the terrifying idea in Germany is that German car makers would end up being treated as Chinese car makers in Europe and as European car makers in China. And that's a very possibility if we, tariff EV aggressively and face retaliation by China. And so I think that position, that very original position of Germany in the EV industry in Europe is central and makes the definition of a buy-European, which is the whole work of the Commission as it stands. I'm not surprised that they're pushing back the IIA time and again, because they're precisely grappling with that, makes it difficult. And a last point on the idea of partnership. And I heard you earlier sounding quite skeptical about joint venture agreements. And, I hear you. I don't think they are perfect, but I think they're better in the absence of a joint venture framework. I'm thinking of battery plants. There's a great piece of work by a young scholar called Palma Poliak, who's studied 5 battery plants in Europe, from Sweden to Hungary, by way of France, Germany. And it's unbelievable to observe the differences in environmental standards, in social standards, in public subsidy, in green or not green energy feeding these battery plants. And so what basically we're seeing is that there is no level playing field in Europe for creating a battery plant. They all operate with either a Korean or a Chinese investor, with completely different levels of transparency. And what is the result of that? The result of that is that the best plant, the Northvolt one, which had the cleanest environmental standards, the lowest level of public subsidy, the highest level of social worker right, and so on and so forth, went bankrupt. And it went bankrupt, why? Because BMW had placed an order of $2 billion for their batteries and basically canceled that order to place it with the Hungarian battery plant, which had no environmental standards, no social protection, and basically not clean energy. So, we have, by not having a clear joint venture framework, created a completely uneven playing field for the battery industry in Europe. And we have actually favored those that are the least clean. And so I think having, and I hope this will be part of the Industry Accelerator Act, having a clear framework for joint venture with China, to me, it may not be the silver bullet, but I think it's absolutely necessary to avoid these kinds of failures we've seen in the battery world.
If I may abuse my position as chair, I always like to say what's good for Volkswagen is not always what's good for Germany. And I think your point was a case in point. And when I saw that program come out, I had a tear and thought, if the Germans can't help themselves, then I don't know who will. But you wanted to react to Shahin.
Just 10, 20 seconds. My point was basically that the EV price undertakings may well happen, but I don't think that they would be representative of a great salve for the overall relationship, because they do not do anything about the underlying issues, which I suppose is my point, is that, well, it's been portrayed as something that would be terribly meaningful from the Chinese side, but from the Europeans, I don't know what problem it actually addresses.
Maybe quickly, I don't think it solves anything or everything, but I'm pretty certain that it's worth without it.
JANKA, yeah.
I was just going to say, just briefly on the sort of the dynamic that we're seeing in the industry. You used to have a very strong alliance between the machinery tool makers, the machine makers, the kind of suppliers, and the OEMs. And that is fracturing across the board, and that is confusing the German political system. because you're being lobbied from players that you thought were on one side from different angles. And this is why this is, what used to be a good guiding principle, if it was good for Volkswagen, was good for the rest of the supply chain as well. That is no longer true as well. So we're seeing a massive change of the political economy of Germany, that a government that is constantly having to deal with Greenland, with Venezuela, with whatever happens in the world, just doesn't have the attention span at the moment to fully address. And this is where you see then this split between where the party is and some of the growth ideas of the CDU versus some of the statements that you hear from Merz where you think he's on a totally different planet than the party.
Can I press you just for a little bit of a glass ball? Where's this going? Because I observed the same. You have the German machine builders. Some of them once told me, which I think illustrates how diverse the landscape is now. Yeah, sounded nice, you talk about industrial policy. Why don't we just put a rule in the single market that outlaws all German machines, Chinese machines? We're pro-free trade, but a rule would be nice. That's very clear. And I said, wow, that's a very radical measure. And then you talk to Volkswagen, you get a different story. So where is this political economy landing, let's say, over the next year?
Yeah, I just recently had a conversation with the VDMA, the German Machinery Association, and one of the things was there was like, our positions have narrowed quite a bit, and I just said, yeah, but I haven't moved. So I think that just tells you where the where they have come to now, which is quite striking. I think that this is destined for a major rupture. The election on 8th of March in Baden-Württemberg, may not be so interesting for most Europeans, but actually is one to watch out for. This is kind of car capital of Germany, and what we are seeing there will tell us, how worried people are about the future of their jobs, how high the AfD figures are really going to be, whether the CDU is going to, recapture this state, and by what majority. So this is what drives Merz's agenda as well, not just sort of macroeconomic data. And I think one point that is really important is, while we're oozing, literally hemorrhaging industrial jobs at the moment, it doesn't show up in the unemployment statistics because they're absorbed elsewhere and there are other changes that are happening in the economy. As long as it doesn't create a massive political problems because unemployment numbers are skyrocketing, it is a problem that you may want to not talk about for right now.
JOANNA.
I don't know whether this is breaking the flow of the discussion.
No,
there will be a second round of questions.
Yeah, we still have 5 minutes, I think, so okay. It's great to get some reactions to each other.
I just very briefly wanted to react to what FINBARR said, and I don't feel offended by any of the comments. I count myself among good people of trade that you referred to. But on your impatience, understandable, I think we are all a bit impatient, but to put it in the context, we are talking about long-term processes. So you said we haven't done too much over the past 3 years. Well, probably more could have been done. But I think we are where we are today, and we have to take stock of what we did, what we didn't do, and ask ourselves the question, are we on track or not? Do we have the elements that should be part of the solution or not? I think this is the right way to think of it. Now, it's not 3 years, or it's not even 5 years that will make a difference, because China has been thinking about China 2020, made in China 2025, 10 years back, and has been, this is what, 15th edition of the 5-year plan. I'm not sure this is exactly the way we've been thinking about our economy. So I think 3 years is maybe not such a scandalous time, as long as it's used very well. So I think that is what we also have to think of. And then, there's an important point on the US that one of you made, and on how we construct our overall approach. There are elements of the solution that we are aware of, and maybe more aware of today than we were half a year ago. There are what we call known unknowns, but there are plenty of unknown unknowns. And if someone asked us a year and a half ago, can we think about how to tackle China challenge with US, we would have probably said, of course we can. We are at a moment in time where we have to ask ourselves a question. Do we build a partnership with the US and everyone else when it comes to tackling China, or are we not? And this is an important element in the overall consideration how to take forward China policy of the EU. And to your point of Carnegie moment, well, or Canada moment, if there will be a moment for Europe, there will be one. But I don't think we should be running after Australia moment or Canada moment, or all of a sudden become friends with China today because we have a shift in the US policy. I think there is certain build-up that has to take place before we start thinking about any great bargain. And certainly, I agree with you, price undertaking has not been conceived as an element of the Great Bargain. So I think we should really turn the page and focus on what matters. One little comment on Northvolt. I think it's a little bit more complex than what has been presented. Why I say that, it's not because I have an intimate knowledge of the Northvolt failure, or success, by the way, big success for a long time. It's because we have to be careful drawing too simplistic conclusions for one-off situations. First of all, we have to see what didn't go well and build on this. And I think the first failure doesn't mean we will not succeed going forward. But when you say that we should be pleading for clear joint venture framework for the EU, I agree with you. But let's think what really makes sense. Let's be precise. Let's think about consequences. And let's really assess whether this is something that helps us long term or causes us problems very soon around the corner. So I think this is far more complex discussion, and we really have to be very precise about what we are discussing here and not easily throw ideas that maybe there is a silver bullet, because there is none. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So we have 2 minutes to the dot left. So I wanted to ask in reverse order all of you that if you had to pick one policy Europe should pursue in its dealings with China or in the China-US triangle, in one sentence, what would it be? So Shahin.
I think I would answer the point that was raised earlier. I don't think we can or should rely on the US to deal with China. We are on our own when it comes to dealing with China, and we're on our own when it comes to dealing with the US. So I think the one thing I would focus on is freeing ourselves from export control rules from the United States that are preventing us from dealing freely with China. And that's a reference directly to ASML made earlier.
Okay, so we ship ASML machines to China, and
or we decide what we ship or we don't ship, but we run away from being dependent on the US for deciding that.
Thank you, Maria.
Well, I don't think I want to answer your question, actually. I think that's too difficult. But I will say an example of a very good policy, which I think does exactly what I would like to have in terms of this resilience, and that is the digital era. I think the digital era, I think, Shahin, you indirectly referred to it, was anticipatory in terms of the economic security argument, which is the reliance on American payment systems. It was early enough, and it was there done by policymakers to address exactly this issue, amongst other things, and it is advancing at good speed. So that's the kind of policy making that we want, anticipatory and aiming directly at economic resilience.
Thank you. You want to answer the question? I know it's a difficult one, but a thought is welcome.
Somehow I think I already gave elements of the answer in my previous comment. But what I would say is, I don't think this is about China or this is about US. This is about us. This is about where we want to be, what game we want to play. This is about how we want to construct our industrial policy or a single market and how we want to project it outside. So I think it's a more universal dilemma that we have to face, clearly underpinned by what we face from China or from the US. But this is really about how we see ourselves, irrespectively of one or the other player, in a perspective that is mid or long term.
FINBARR, very brief.
I say this more as a journalist who's looking for an exciting story than a proper analyst, but let's demythicize this nonsense about the trade bazooka and fire it. We had instances all over the course of last year with Greenland, with the rare earth export controls, and it's been gathering dust, and we all want to see what happens when you actually shoot it, and maybe you might get some results from the US and from China.
I would say the last thing we should do is sell ASML machines to China. And then I think the one thing that is core to me, I agree with FINBARR, we should have used the ACI already, because if we use it against the United States for a territorial sovereignty act against our territorial sovereignty, we put the bar here. And that's pretty bad, because then everyone can say China didn't actually violate our sovereignty. So I'm very cautious about using it against the US. But what we really need to do is get the Germans to fully support single market reform, because without that, we're not getting anywhere. So this is actually, if you get the Germans to actually support this, then we're making strides.
Thank you. Thanks to our panel. I guess I'll wrap up with: rid ourselves of American export control dependence, digital euro, think about yourself, The Germans need to get behind the single market and fire the bazooka. Thank you.
Okay, can I ask the next panel to join? I will